And this touches on a third point, which is the time horizon. So when you think about conversations about mission, they're often framed in years, if not decades. When are we going to accomplish our goal? And when we talk about money, it's framed perhaps in years, if not quarters. And those disparities in time horizon mean that we're not actually building program and costs and activities in line and in the same rhythms as the funding sources that we're building. So these are just some of our aptitudes. And actually, one other aptitude inclination, just a funny story, is actually about stories, which is when we think about what we are in some sense providing to the outside world, we're providing social change, but we're also providing stories. And the difference between our realistic when we create projections, the tension between what is a projection for our own management purposes versus what is a projection for external communication is great. And it's not that nonprofits generally don't have two sets of books. I mean, this actually might be a case where it made sense. But we did a project once with an organization that worked very hard and scrubbed all of the numbers, and in the end came up with a 10% annual growth rate for a 3 to 5 year period of time. And it was going to affect a lot more kids, and it was going to be fabulous. One of the board members said, you know what? 10% or less just doesn't do it. You're going to have to change the plan. It just wasn't exciting, right? And so this level between what's in some sense exciting versus what's realistic is there. So there are things about our aptitudes, our inclinations, the reasons why we joined the sector. The second I would posit is that the conventional, is that our state of knowledge is weak. By and large, when it comes to funding, we go by conventional wisdom. I was at a conference at Harvard talking about funding strategy, and there were certain principles, and the single most agreed upon principle was diversified funding sources. The goal of every nonprofit ought to be diversification of their funding sources. For risk management and all the reasons you would expect, if you have government, we want to add individual. If we have individual, we want to add corporate. And I've been on boards of nonprofits where we have brainstorming sessions about this, and everyone has a different idea, we break and we go for it. And it turns out, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, that the research shows that for nonprofits that actually succeed in scaling to significant size, diversification is by far the exception, not the rule. Second is that there are trends, there are fads in conventional wisdom. For a while, and a little bit less so today, although still to some extent, earned income was a buzzword. Raising money sucks. Those companies, they've got it easy. They just make it. So let's us get a little bit of that, and start a beneficiary scoop shop, and we're off to the races. And again, it turns out that by and large, earned income ventures, if they're not actually delivering the mission itself and their activities, don't throw off the kind of surplus and profits to fund the core activities. It just rarely happens. And then there are things like government. The number of conversations I've heard where folks say, government is unreliable, government's shrinking, it's going out of business, we need something other than government. And it's just not true. Certain government programs disappear, expectations go up, sometimes government is ineffective for a whole lot of reasons, but government funding the nonprofit sector, particularly what I would call the nonprofit wing of the nonprofit sector, the sort of human services and education and all of that, has gone up faster than GDP, gone up faster than the nonprofit sector itself. It grows. So those are sort of two categories of reasons. And the third, I guess I would touch on a little bit, is the tough times. Tough economic times exacerbate everything in the first two categories. Time horizons. In tough economic times, the time horizons on income shrink dramatically. People are talking about months, quarters at best. And time horizons about when impact is going to achieve extend further into the future. During tough economic times, nonprofit leaders reduce investments in capacity and increase the proportion of funding going to their program activities so that they don't have to cut anything in terms of service, reducing their ability to plan. And the importance of the story versus the realistic projection, the tension becomes all the greater. So in tough economic times, things become worse. Now in the breakout, I want to talk a little bit about the opportunity in tough economic times, particularly for organizations funded by government. And so there's plus side. Change can happen in a more radical way, but it exacerbates the sustainability question. So these are the problems. And when you think about those problems, it's not unforeseen that nonprofits don't meet their forecasts, they don't meet their 5-year plans, they bounce from one funder to another. So what have we learned? Well, as we've looked at this, we've begun to frame our thinking with one fundamental framework, which is that nonprofits, in some sense, need two strategies, and those strategies each relate to external parties. So in the nonprofit world, there's a beneficiary of some type that's trying to be effective, and it's very complicated to figure out the series of actions it takes to create that change and realize it. But once you figure that out, it doesn't solve the funding problem at all. There's a different set of external parties that need to be understood there, whether it's wealthy individual donors, widespread support from the mass of American givers, government, corporate, and they are not giving randomly. They have their own interests. And the nonprofit needs to understand the motivations and needs of that external party just as clearly. Now, they're not totally unrelated, but they're separate. And the larger the nonprofit's aspirations, the more strategic and understandable it is. So if you're looking to raise $100,000 a year, it's possible to turn on a person that hasn't thought about what they would do with that money. And that if you're an inspiring executive director, if your vision is that compelling, someone that in some sense didn't have a designation for that money might give it to you. Same with government pilot programs. If you're looking for $2 million a year, it becomes harder. You need to inspire a few more individuals or get luckier with the individual you inspire. If you're looking for $20 million a year or even $10 million a year, it really becomes hard. It's just, there are fewer pots of money of that size that are undesignated. Government pots already have a purpose. Individuals that are giving away that kind of money on an annual basis typically have actually thought about what they want to do with it, have some set of goals and strategies. So the notion that you can, in some sense, from a blank slate redirect that money becomes less and less. And that's where data and research and strategy, you can begin to map out what makes sense. So we begin to look at these two equations. And what's important to understand here is that this is very different from the for-profit world. In the for-profit world, by and large, you have a customer. And if you can figure out how to deliver a product or service of value to that customer, you've discovered your funding model. Now, I don't want to sort of gloss over all of business research and thinking in that one sentence, but pricing strategy is complicated, all of these other things, but by and large, there's a two-way exchange of value that's one equation. And in the nonprofit world, there are two equations to master. And that makes strategy for nonprofits more complicated. And in an article I wrote for the Stanford Social Innovation Review, I had some line, just almost a toss-away comment about how strategy is harder for nonprofits than for-profits. And the editor called me up and said, "Are you serious about that? Do you really mean that?" And I said, "Yeah, I do think that's true." And it is because of this funding complication. Now, as we have studied that, looking at larger organizations by and large, we did a comprehensive study of every nonprofit that hit $50 million in size. We've done more anecdotal or representative research at organizations that are $10, $20 million in size. We found a few things. One, which I mentioned already, is that diversification is the exception rather than the rule for organizations that truly grow. 90% of the organizations that hit 50 million in size receive 90% of their money from a single source. Now that doesn't mean a single payer, but a single source that matched the activities they did.